Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Lean Startup webcast. Today's topic is the state of Lean Startup with Eric Ries. I'm Felicia Chanko, production manager of Lean Startup Company. We have our Lean Startup Week in San Francisco coming up on October 31st to November 6th. Please visit leanstartup.co for more information. Our speaker today is Eric Ries. Eric is an entrepreneur and author of The Lean Startup, How Today's Entrepreneurs Use Continuous Innovation to Create Radically Successful Business, and the recently published Kickstarter-backed The Leader's Guide. Moderating today is Phil Dillard, lead of faculty in curriculum development for Lean Startup Company. A few housekeeping notes. We will be taking questions from the audience via the live chat. If you'd like to ask a question, please flag it by starting with a Q: before your question. This is an hour-long program, and the recording will be available after this live webcast. Take it away, Phil and Eric.
Thanks, Felicia. Hey, good morning, Eric. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's great to have you with us. Love to jump in and get started. I know that we have a lot of people on the line with us today who have different levels of experience with the Lean Startup. I want to make sure that everyone listening can get a better understanding of where we are, where we're going, and how they can make the most of Lean Startup Week. So for the time we have together, I'd like to tackle this conversation in three parts. First, just go over some highlights of, first to go over the current state of Lean Startup and its evolution, and then to go over some highlights of what's going on in the conference and what people can expect to get out of what looks like an amazing Lean Startup Week this week. And finally, we want to make sure that we break aside a little time to talk about what everybody's asking about, and that's really about the latest developments with the long-term stock exchange. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Okay. Yeah, welcome, everybody. Glad you're joining us. So let's start with a really easy start. Over the last 5 years, since you first published the book, the Lean Startup has come a long way. How do you currently describe what exactly the Lean Startup is?
Well, I've been asked this question a lot the last 5 years. I mean, just to give people some context, it's hard even for me to fathom, but the Lean Startup was published in September 2011, so just over 5 years ago. And it's been a real whirlwind since then. You know, at the time, Lean Startup was really, it was a Silicon Valley phenomenon. It was really about software and technology, and has morphed and grown way beyond that in recent years, which is of course amazing. When people ask me for the short version, like what is it? You know, I usually tell them this is a management system for dealing with situations of extreme uncertainty through rapid experimental testing. So a scientific approach to managerial problems based in empiricism, based in hypothesis testing, and based in speed. And of course, it's built on a number of famous antecedents: the lean production system, Toyota production system, lean manufacturing certainly being an important one, customer development, various agile flavors of agile software development, DevOps, design thinking. There's a lot of things that have come before. But I think what sets Lean Startup apart is that it really is a focus on synthesis and on creating a enterprise-wide vocabulary that can work across functions, across silos, so everybody in the organization can have a common language for talking about what are we learning about what customers really want. How are initiatives proceeding based on learning, not just on vanity metrics.
So how does that common lexicon, that common language, describe a little bit of where the Lean Startup is today? And by that, I mean there are a number of different types of organizations that are early stage, mid-size, and large companies that we've seen that are using Lean Startup. And if you're to describe, this is where it started and where it is today in those organizations, can you give a little more example or color for people who are getting up to speed, getting at whatever level they're at, they're getting deeper into Lean Startup?
I was counting it up the other day. I have literally worked at every order of magnitude in the last 5 years, from two guys in a garage up to hundreds of thousands of employees. So, I mean, literally, like the 2-person company, the 20-person company, the 200-person company, the 2,000-person company, the 20,000-person company, and the 200,000-person company. I mean, I've seen it adopted in all of those situations, and it's really interesting. The most common desire in all of corporate settings and even a lot of nonprofit organizational settings is to inject startup DNA into the organization. I mean, that is by far the most common request that I get asked about. Everyone who has any kind of sense of innovation and growth in the future, they want that startup energy and productivity, and they want to know how to have it. So one way of looking at this, at the lean startup as a management system, it's as a way to inject that startup DNA into organizations that have lost it. But it's also a blueprint for having true startups scale up and keep that startup feel. Because the other thing I hear from most founders is, I'm going to be the perpetual startup. Our startup is going to keep innovating. We're going to keep disrupting ourselves even as we scale. And yet the vast majority of startups wind up becoming big, dumb companies, even though they didn't intend to. So part of this is realizing that wherever we are on the S curve, we have common issues and common challenges that require us to build structures that support innovation and entrepreneurial style thinking.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, regardless of the size of the organization, you've seen lean startups successfully implemented in organizations of all sizes, and that there are a lot of common challenges. If you start as a startup, you want to grow up and be a lean company, not the thing that you left to create something that was different, and you need to learn a way to do that. And lean startup gives you an approach for that. Were there any surprises that you've seen either in certain sizes of companies or across the board that were kind of unexpected lessons about applying the lean startup that worked in one environment versus another, or that worked across all of them?
There's always surprises, and every organization is unique. And a big part of the first phase of deploying lean startup anywhere, big or small, is translating the principles and concepts into a domain-specific, company-specific language and set of tactics. So not every company adopts it the same way. Not every company uses all the tools. Not every company uses all the vocabulary. Sometimes they develop their own vocabulary. You know, at GE, the program is called FastWorks. At Intuit, the program is called Design for Delight. And if you compare and contrast those two programs, the look and feel of them is really different. Because one of the things I've learned, and has been a big surprise for me, is that every company has a certain function, a certain kind of flavor that is dominant. So the engineering, finance-driven company, you know, like a GE, you know, just think about that, like very rigorous, back to the Jack Welch era, Six Sigma has a very certain kind of feel. Compare and contrast to Intuit, much more design-oriented, much more soft, you know, much higher EQ kind of place, much more, you know, design and kind of product management-driven than finance-driven, which comes a lot, you know, if you compare and contrast the two founders, you know, this is like Thomas Edison and Jack Welch and all these legendary GE managers versus Scott Cook, who's really a real humanist. So those two programs look really different. They have different terminology. The training programs are different. The coaching programs are different, but the principles are the same. So what you see when you kind of deconstruct it schematically, they've taken the principles and adapted them into their local environment. And just how much of that adaptation is required has been really a really interesting learning for me as I've seen this go from organization to organization.
It seems like there are a couple things that work too when you talk about that. There's one part of it is that organizational culture, and another part of it is actually how does it permeate in an organization? It's like almost like the difference between strategy and tactics in my mind, if that's a good way to describe it. Can we start with the culture part first? Because there's a big part of accepting lean startup as management that the culture of an organization either embraces or resists. And can you talk a little bit about how some of these either mid-sized and fast-growing companies or large companies can benefit in their culture from applying lean startup?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a pyramid diagram about midway through the lean startup called the startup way, which is just a very simple sequence of accountability, process, culture, people, in that order. And usually people want to go tops down through that hierarchy. So give me new people, buy me a fancy startup, get me some give me new people who are more innovative than people I got now. And then let's figure out how to build an innovative culture. So, hey, everybody, be more innovative, take more risks, be more disruptive, or whatever, like slogans, posters, the kind of like beer bash, like cheap HR stuff. And what's funny is that everyone understands that culture is of primary importance. I mean, the only thing more cliche than, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast is that people are everything. So like obviously the top of the pyramid, that's everything we do exists to support building a culture that supports the best people. But how do you create culture? How do you change culture? You cannot do it. My experience is it's absolutely impossible unless you're willing to change the accountability and process systems that underlie the culture. So if you go now to success stories, you go to startups that have scaled and grown and have a really innovative culture, or you go to companies that have been through this transformation and changed their culture from one to the other. What are the elements of the new culture? It's pretty easy to describe. When I'm talking to CEOs and they tell me what's the before and after, what should I look for, I always say, this is the number one thing. Imagine a random person in your organization. I roll a 100,000 sided die and it pops up employee number, 22,131, random person. They have an incredible idea that's the next disruptive best thing, right? This is like a kid with the next Facebook and they're sitting there. It's like Steve Wozniak begging HP to build the Apple computer instead of having to do it as serve. So someone in your organization has the perfect idea for what's next. What is the mechanism by which they can turn that idea into an experiment to prove that it's a good idea? And people look at me, they're like, what do you mean? It's like, let me go interview let's go interview some people. Let's go walk around, right? An old lean manufacturing idea. Go to the source, walk around, see it for yourself. Well, let's go to the factory floor, find me a random factory floor person, and let me see, can I ask them this question? Do you know how to get your idea implemented? And most employees are like, you ask them that question, they're totally stumped. They're like, well, I guess if I had a really good idea, I could ask my manager to ask his manager to like laterally go over 3 levels in the hierarchy to a different silo and ask that person's manager to tell. And like by the time they describe what would be required, they're like, forget it. I mean, that's never going to happen. It's much too difficult, moving on. So it's totally demoralizing. It's a culture of doing what you're told. It's a culture of staying your focus locally on your area of responsibility. It's a culture that is almost guaranteed to be non-innovative, but to be highly reliable. So the whole idea of kind of 20th century management ideas, it was really about reducing variation and variability. It was about getting standard performance across many different people. And I don't want to knock that. That was a real accomplishment. But any culture that reduces variability is guaranteed to reduce innovation, since innovation is a, by definition, variability enhancer. So that's the culture we want. We want a culture where you went and interviewed somebody and said, hey, how do you do that? They say, oh, no, of course, everyone knows the process to turn into an experiment. Now, what they would say is, not only do I know the process, but it's no big deal. I'm not going to get fired if it's a bad experiment, but neither do I have a sense of entitlement. Listen, just because I say it's a good idea, that doesn't make it a good idea. Just because my boss says it's a good idea, the facts say it's a good idea. So let's run the experiment and find out. And I'll tell you a story. One of my favorite stories of a good culture. I was talking to, I happened to overhear this. This was not a meeting I was in. It was like literally in the cubicle next to where I was having a meeting. There was a really junior engineer right out of college, maybe 22. And the CEO of this company, mid-sized company, not like, Jack Welch himself, but the CEO walks into his cube and asks him to make a change to the product. Just random, CEO got up in the shower this morning. I got a great idea. We got a blah, blah, blah. And the junior engineer says, oh, that's thank you I'm so honored that you would choose me to implement this. That's really good. Sounds like a great idea. Let's do an experiment. And we'll split test it against what exists now. We'll show that it's better. And the CEO is like, no, I don't think we need to do that. Let's just dispense with it. Just could you implement it, please? And the engineer, to his credit, I could hear the nervousness in his voice, but he said, well, with all due respect, sir, seems like such a good idea. We should experiment. And just like held his ground and would not yield. And the CEO was finally like, and it kind of, because he was so like, he was very patient about it. He was respectful about it, but he was firm that this is our way. This is our culture. This is what we do here. This is a CEO who created that culture in the first place. But, all of us, we forget, our ego gets in the way. And the CEO, of course, like eventually is like realizes that this guy's doing the right thing and says, okay, you're absolutely right. We should do this experiment, and walks away. And you could hear the sigh of relief, like, phew. But what's so remarkable, so here's why this is a culture story, not like, oh, this is an amazing engineer or this is a terrible CEO, or it's a culture story, because the reason he could stand up for the process was that he knew for sure that everybody in his team, everyone in the company would back him up. because that's just the way we work here. And there's no exceptions, no ifs, ands, or buts, no pulling rank by title or anything like that.
That's super. It's a great story, and it seems to encapsulate the vision of a lean enterprise, right? Regardless of the size, that the culture dictates the right way to behave, and it reflects driving a whole lot of value to the organization. If the idea is so great, the experiment's going to show that it's great, and everybody's going to be excited, or the CEO is going to go, "Huh, that was a bad idea. I'm glad you followed the process. Awesome." And people are rewarded.
And I had CEO, and I had the opportunity to learn from that.
Yeah. So it's a supervision, right? But I bet there are lots of people who hear the story and they go, okay, well, we're really far from that. Either, we've got some buy-in at the top, or we've got some buy-in at the ground level, and there's this big mass in the middle of these middle managers who fear change or don't want to change, or we're early on here at a startup stage and we haven't gotten to that point where we have that problem. But those are two kind of extremes. Maybe we could tackle both of those extremes, starting with the startup one first. I'm thinking first in like application of lean startup, and maybe in terms of sort of things that those sort of folks could look at in lean startup week coming up. How should they consider digesting lean startup if you're just starting out and you want to make sure that you build that culture and build that sort of environment?
Sure. The thing that really is remarkable about the best startups is that to them, implementing new processes and tools they're literally no big deal. So the startups that make a big deal about how great they are process-wise, I have high skepticism of. Even the ones that are like lean startup zealots and want to come up to me and be like, we do everything by the book, and every day we read a chapter from your book and whatever. And I'm just like, no, that's not the message. The message is serve customers, create value, do your work, and let these tools help you when you need them. But don't get excited about the tools for their own sake. So I'll give you an example. I was talking to a startup that is now, I think they're at unicorn status now, but this is early on in their life. They were maybe 50 employees at the time I'm having this conversation. And I talked to the CEO, a very famous CEO, you all know his name. And he was just offhandedly mentioning to me that they do continuous deployment, which is a lean startup technique where we put code into production as quickly as it's written, up to 50 or 100 times a day. So extremely small batch size between development and deployment, and there's a whole method and set of technologies required to make it work. Well, we can talk about it more if people are interested. And I was so excited. I was like, oh, that's so great. How did you decide to do continuous deployment? It's a controversial, this is especially a few years ago, this is still a very controversial thing. Here's a high profile person who, I wouldn't have expected to embrace it. Different than what he had done in his previous startup. He's like, oh, I read your blog post about it, and it seemed like a good idea. So I passed it around my team. We decided to do it. And then from that point on, we did it. And I was like, well, that's not a very interesting story. Could you give me some more color about it? And he's like, not really. It wasn't that big a deal. And I was like, okay, but can I put you on stage to talk about this thing? He's like, no, that's like you're putting me on stage to talk about how I breathe every day. And I make sure to breathe some oxygen. And it's like, duh. It's like, who doesn't do that? Who's like so dumb that they need me to come to? I literally could never get him on the record to talk about it because he just thought it was obvious. What's the big deal? So that's what you want. You want the vibe in your company that like best practices, always doing better, continuous improvement are not a big deal. They're not something to be like made a fuss about. They're just something you do every day. And so you do 5 whys. Okay, another famous startup. I was just in their like team. They were doing a team presentation to new employees. I happened to be sitting in, and they were showing their values and all the critical. And like 5 whys was like number 8. It's like we always, whenever there's any kind of problem, we do root cause analysis. We do 5 whys. We get to the bottom of it. And I was like, oh, this is so great. Can you guys like come talk about 5 whys? They were like, no, it's what's nothing to talk about. We just do it. And I was like, well, how did you decide to do it? They were like, remember when you came to speak to us 3 years ago? I'm like, He's like, you said we should do it. So they were like, oh, that's a good idea. We did it. It's like, it was not a big deal. Just so it doesn't make a good story, but that's, at the startup side of it, that's really what I recommend. Don't become a lead. Don't try to turn this into a religion. Just use the tools where they're helpful to get better at your work.
Mm-hmm. Super. Okay. That's the simplicity, become part of your DNA, do the smart things, and good things will follow. Yeah. So let's talk about a little bit about the other extreme, because one of the questions came in where people asked about lean startup going corporate, being involved a lot more in corporate. How do you address skeptics? But what I've seen recently is that whole scenario where there are people at the ground level who get into lean startup, or there are people at the executive level who get in at the lean startup, and they both complain about the middle, saying we have to solve the problems in this middle management layer. So if they're trying to work through that transition to get to the vision that you described of this lean enterprise, how do they get started? Where can people start to grab onto to start that journey?
Sure. Look, the skepticism is well warranted. Anyone who is being asked to change and is not skeptical, I'm a little bit weirded out by that. I think a modern company that is effectively run and that does its work quarter after quarter at scale is a remarkable organism. And anyone who's eager to start just throwing things around and making changes at random, like you're playing with dark forces, and you can build a Frankenstein pretty easily. So like, I have respect for the fact that the modern world is run and powered by these organisms that are remarkably effective, especially compared to, like, if you look at the best corporations that we were able to build, like in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they literally could not do the things that we do. Forget the technology. Obviously, we have much better technology than they did, but they didn't have the statistical understanding of what we would call cost accounting. They literally couldn't figure out which products were profitable and not profitable. They could not run the level of supply chain that we're able to run. That's just like, there were certain core competencies that they didn't have yet. And as much as people like to derive branding and marketing as skills gone amok, like the matching of people's desires to the right product to serve those desires, like to be able to do that on a global basis is a remarkable thing. So, next time you're in your like local convenience store and like, you're like, oh, I really need a AA battery. Like, appreciate the miracle that I guarantee you can buy a AA battery 24 hours a day, for $1.99, whatever it costs. Like, it's right there for you. Just think about the work that was required to make that happen, from the government to the, to the people who assembled the physical thing, to the plant, to the company. It's a remarkable thing. So anyone who's trying to mess with that willy-nilly, I don't have any respect for that. But change or die. So we have to find ways to change these organisms in a productive, safe, coherent way. And the way to overcome that skepticism is to treat the transformation like a startup. This is the cool part of it. The same skills that we would ask of our product teams to test their hypotheses, to do rapid scaling once, we call it think big, start small, scale fast. That same philosophy should be applied to the transformation itself. So if you're in an organization at whatever level, think it'd be like, I want to be the founder, like, of GE's Fastworks. GE's Fastworks has two co-founders, people who actually built the startup that did the hyper growth from 2 people to hundreds of thousands of their employees. That's a startup team that is built and scaled. So so the way you do that is you build a minimum viable product. Like, don't try to go change every middle manager. Go get one team to work this way. Get their manager okay with it. We did one team at GE, then we did 4 teams. And we did 8 teams, then we started to do 8 teams at a time every couple of months. Like, we started to build it up slowly, building the critical mass, doing the translation. We call it the phase 1 of the transformation. Demonstrating to the whole organization that this could work and was worthwhile. And it was a huge amount of prep work required before we could go big and get the CEO, to declare, okay, everyone's going to get trained in this, and we're going to go tops down. And then we're going to really work on those middle managers.
Super. That gives a nice roadmap for people. One of the things that came to mind while you were talking about that is that a lot of startups, I think it sounds like a decent number of enterprises are going to be cautious about making that move, and a decent number of startups want to be relevant to enterprises. I think some startups and some enterprises see startups as outsourced R&D or opportunities to engage with this innovation community. So do you see an approach in here for both sides to be thinking about how they can engage better with each other using lean startup thinking as well?
Yeah, the problem is repeated at multiple levels. So I would say the core misunderstanding that we're dealing with right now, like if you want to get theoretical for a second, is that there are currently 4 different activities that all corporations do that are managed separately as if they were in 4 different departments, but are actually the same thing. You have true new product innovation. So I want to intentionally create a disruptive innovation myself by investing in an internal team to go build a new product that has high uncertainty. You have corp dev. So it's like, I want to go buy a startup. I don't want to do it myself. I want to go buy someone else who will, who's already done it, and I want to pay an appropriate price to integrate them into my organization. I want to build a new internal process, like an IT system, HR system. I have some internal change that I want to do, or I want to do a corporate transformation. Like I want to change my own management decision-making process. All 4 of those activities should be called entrepreneurship and should be managed similarly. Because if you don't, they have to work together. So like classic corp dev is, well, first of all, let's make a build buy decision. So let's see if we could build it ourselves versus, okay, let's go buy this. So first of all, how can you make a build buy decision if you can't evaluate entrepreneurial progress and opportunity? So you have to have a common standard for evaluating how the internal team would do versus the external team, which most people don't. Then you say, okay, we decided to buy it. So let's go buy a startup. How do you figure out what it's worth if you don't have a rigorous methodology for evaluating startup progress? Okay, so you make your evaluation. Now you have to integrate. I once met a big company, Fortune 500 company executive. He was in corp dev. It was his job. And he said to me, I have a question. I've always wondered. We buy startups all the time. In the last 10 years, we bought X startup. We bought this startup and that startup. And we always do it on the theory that their like cultural DNA will infect the parent company and make us more innovative. So you'd think by random chance, sometimes the osmosis would move the way we want. But every single time, 100% of the time, we change them to be like us. So the startup's culture instantly dies and they adopt the parent company's culture. Like, do you know why that is? I was like, how can you not know why that is? Isn't that your, like, aren't you the corp dev? But of course, it's not his job. His job is to make the purchase. What happens next is somebody else's job. So the integration requires planting this precious plant into new soil. Hey, guess what? It's the same hostile soil that prevented you from building the thing in the first place. That's why when you did the build buy evaluation, you bought this. So it's totally nuts to me to have not common standards and to have passing that work off across functions instead of treating that as one common function, calling it entrepreneurship and being done with it.
Yeah, critical challenge for the enterprise to do it right, and probably also maybe a little bit of a cautionary tale for the startup who either hopes to be acquired or have some sort of big growth or liquidity event, because you have to know the pathways of where you're going and what you could be getting yourself into, if I'm hearing you right.
I always thought the word exit was very ominous, and I think it is. Be careful what you wish for.
Does this change at all when you think if you're coming into a company that already has processes like lean manufacturing or a strong agile practice, or they've grew up with design thinking? Is there a specific additional layer of resistance or acceptance because they have those strong disciplines there?
Both. You get both. It's you definitely have pros and cons. First of all, I really believe in identifying what the company is already good at and attaching the transformation to that. So I think having a the pre-existing skills that are really valuable, I found, exposure to lean manufacturing. If people have Six Sigma or lean manufacturing background, then you have a huge conceptual vocabulary to say, listen, you already have this skill. Let me help you show it how it's in a new domain. Extensive exposure to scientific method. So companies that are R&D based, big R&D labs, like hardcore scientists, like you'd be like, listen, all I want you to do is apply the scientific method to your business the same you do in the lab. Like that's the conversation you can have. Of course, design thinking, customer development, DevOps, those are less popular, but still very valuable sources of pre-existing. There's one other, which is that like there are certain companies that have a lot of military veterans and people who've been through the OODA loop and kind of maneuver warfare theory. Like that is also super helpful. And I found a lot of those folks can again, you're tapping into a conceptual vocabulary that they really understand, and importing it, using that to help people move through the transformation. And it goes to what I was talking about before about making it indigenous, translating it into the organization's way of working. It's helpful to have those hooks and connections. Now, it only works because we as the Lean Startup community have done the hard work of really answering these questions of, well, how does it connect? How does it tie in? And that's where the theory becomes really valuable. The flip side of it is you have to overcome people's egos. Like, well, hold on, if Lean Startup is related or connected to design thinking, how come the CEO is all excited about Lean Startup? Why don't we just teach the CEO design thinking? And so you have to get people over their pride. Usually most organizational silos are fighting with each other for supremacy in the organization. And one of the biggest fights is who gets to impose whose methodology on who else. So can I tell you how many engineers are like, I got to get the designers to do agile, and the design thinking people are like, I got to get the MBAs to do design thinking, and the MBAs are like, but I got to get the engineers to do customer development or whatever, like whatever their thing is, DevOps. People get religious about it, and there's always this fight. And most CEOs, like every day of their life, there's like 5 different VPs telling them, oh, boss, you got to put me in charge of the other factions, and then this will be great. And, you know, that kind of like totalitarian attitude doesn't engender cross-functional collaboration, to say the least. And in fact, I often have to have these meetings where people come to me and they're like, listen, isn't Lean Startup just design thinking or agile? Isn't that just agile rebranded for the business people? I'm always like, listen, you're totally right. It is. But do me a favor. Don't tell the business people that, or they get really annoyed, right? So just between us, just be our little secret, right? And you do that with every function. Everyone can feel like, well, I had a say in this. Mm-hmm. And the key to Lean Startup is it's not functionally based. It has no origins in one specific function. Entrepreneurship is the missing function in most companies. There is no entrepreneurship function, so there's no possibility for that kind of turf war breaking out over it. And again, gets the whole company onto a common vocabulary, common language around iteration, experimentation, and customers.
That's super. That's super. I heard 3 really good takeaways in there. The first one, that first part, it described like the philosophy of judo inside of an organization, right? Don't fight them at their strength. Just roll with it and turn it into your strength. It's the one part, you know. And the second part being, you know, entrepreneurship is this missing function. I think that really jumped out at me, because if other people are trying to fight, and this, I think, comes down to a little bit of culture and a little bit of being human in an organization, the culture piece, right? Who wants to have dominance? Well, I've got to shift to culture so that nobody has dominance. But if everybody embraces the fact that entrepreneurship is a missing function, is something new for everybody to join onto, and it can help make that transition into a new type of organization.
Yeah,
that's super. Okay, I really love that one. The last point I had, there are a couple other questions here. I've been actually just trying to weave these in together before I move into the next phase. But I know you're pretty much platform agnostic, or at least I've been told so. But somebody wanted to know, what about innovation platforms? Do they really help you give visibility and progress forward? What's your spin on companies like Hype and Spigot or other innovation platforms that help people manage through this process?
I'm not afraid to say I don't know when I don't know. I haven't heard of any of those companies, so I don't know the first thing about it. I will say that there is a nonstop deluge of tools coming in. I mean, people are constantly trying to come up with tools to make this better. I think it's a wonderful thing to experiment in, and in general, I'm very supportive of it. That said, many of the reforms of Lean Startup don't really require technology any more sophisticated than a whiteboard and some 3x5, cards, some pens and paper. Like they're actually very simple. And the thing we're fighting against is the complexifying nature of most workplaces. People try to make things more complicated. So I have yet to find one of these tools that really cuts through and makes the job simpler. Most of them have, I can't speak to the ones that you named. I literally had never heard of them before today. But generally speaking, we have seen tools that try to impose a specific workflow or sequence onto people, which seems like a really good idea. It seems like the educational benefit is there. And yet, think about the best entrepreneurs you know. Like, pick anybody, your favorite I don't know who you admire right now, but like Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, whoever, and just imagine them having a workflow imposed on them from the outside. It's just like, that's not gonna, even if the workflow is a great idea, that's not gonna happen. They're not gonna adopt somebody else's way of thinking. They're gonna think like what makes them great is their own unique distinctiveness. So how can tools support that entrepreneurial independence and vision rather than try to stomp on it? I think that is the hard part in this general category.
So you've got to do the thinking, find and build and modify tools that work for you, so you can digest it and make it your own. Is that right?
I mean, again, I'm really open to somebody having a breakthrough here and coming up with something that really works. And, you know, like I said, the customer should vote with their feet and let the metrics speak for themselves. But I haven't seen anything that has impressed me so far.
Okay. So let me shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit about the conference, the evolution of the lean startup, and particularly some of the things that people are really asking about a lot. So I think we'll let people know that this year we're talking about having speakers go beyond the tactical and talk about building businesses for the long term. The first topic that comes up is, and we've alluded to it a little bit before, this balance between vision and planning and experimentation, because historically companies have tried to plan the future, and we talk about setting a vision and experimenting towards the future. Can you talk just a little bit about the difference between those two, and some thoughts that people should maybe consider coming into the conference?
Between which two?
Between the planning paradigm and the vision experimentation.
Oh, sure. You know, I mean, it's almost a cliche now to kind of joke. People always like that famous quote about plans are useless, but planning is essential. So the plan itself, like trying to predict the future, is a waste of time. I really think that the number of companies I meet where there's some spreadsheet that people believe is a forecast about what's supposed to happen is ridiculous. But the spreadsheet is not the problem. And in fact, the plan that, listen, I've raised money for startups even recently, and I always make a spreadsheet. Everyone makes a spreadsheet. You got to do it. You got to show that your plan can work. You got to say that there is a future scenario that's worthwhile. You know, got to do it. So the spreadsheet's not the problem. It's believing the spreadsheet or allowing your investors to believe the spreadsheet. That's the problem. So I would say the primary difference in mentality between the kind of vision experimentation paradigm and the planning paradigm is recognize that you cannot forecast with accuracy unless you are extrapolating from a long and stable operating history, which no startup has by definition, and very few big companies have anymore. So wherever you are, if you can't make a forecast, but you still have to hold yourself and your team accountable, how do we do it? That's where the experimentation kind of paradigm comes in. And I know it's not the most popular, sexy part of Lean Startup, but we have a whole discipline called innovation accounting, which is about the mathematical modeling required to do that accountability, even when we can't make an accurate forecast.
Okay, super. So those things are going to be helpful for people who are learning those things for themselves. So another thing that comes up, another question I get a lot everywhere I go with Lean Startup Company, people ask about the Leader's Guide. They ask about what it is, what it's about, and they asked if they can get their hands on a copy. And can I hide mine? But can you talk a little bit about how the Leader's Guide evolved, how it's different from the original text? Because there are 2 training sessions at the conference on it, and I think people want to understand, should they go and why, and how might it be useful for them?
Yeah. I'm sorry to everybody who's tried to get a copy and had been frustrated about it. I didn't anticipate this problem when I set this up, but sorry, just how it is. So the way it came about here, I'll be very honest about it. Here's how it happened. I was got to go back in time like 2 years ago, roughly. I had been doing these kind of corporate transformations for a little while, and I had built out this kind of like massive amount of training materials, just like not like workbooks or anything, but just like every company I would go into, we'd have to develop, exercises and workshops and just all the I don't even know what to call it. Like, I didn't know what to call it. It was just this mountain of material, like thousands of frequently asked questions and answers and all this stuff. So I was sitting on it. I was like, well, I don't know what to do with this mountain of material. At the same time, my publisher was starting to give me the gentle nudge about, hey, you're going to write a sequel to the Lean Startup, and I'm starting to have those negotiations and thinking about, okay, maybe there's another book to write about these topics. And I eventually settled on I was going to write a new mainstream book. It's called The Startup Way. With any luck, it will be published next year. This is a few years ago, so that was still long in the future. And I was like, God, it just drives me crazy that the traditional publishing process would pay me a big advance to buy this book. I would go lock myself in a room for several years. write this beautiful manuscript and then launch it on the world unsuspecting. That doesn't feel very lean, right? I was like, that's not really the way I like to work. Plus, the one thing that has kept me up at night on many occasions since the Lean Startup was published is, what is my responsibility as an author for people's misunderstanding of my own work? Like, I hear all the time, people misapply Lean Startup. They think lean just means cheap. It just means, build something crappy. People think minimum viable product is an excuse to ship something of low quality, unsafe, whatever. Like, there's all these nonsense interpretations out there. And of course, the ego part of me wants to be like, well, anyone that misunderstands, like, they're just an asshole who didn't read the book. So go read the book and whatever. But then, the more I think about it, and it really struck me because around this time, there was that big takedown article about Clay Christensen and attacking him for all the people that have misunderstood disruptive innovation. It was like, I did not like that article one bit. I think Clay is a wonderful person. I think his work is amazing. And I just felt like it was such an attack on him. And plenty of people rose to his defense and set him straight. But to what extent do we have authors have a responsibility, not just to the words as we intended them, but to the actual impact they have in the field after human beings consume the ideas and whatever they go next? So that idea has really always stuck with me, that I don't know that my responsibility is total. I obviously can't control what people do, but don't I have an obligation to experiment and test and try to figure out as best I can how to avoid those misunderstandings? Anyway, that was what I was thinking about. And I was like, when I wrote the Lean Startup, all the experimentation and testing I had to do, I did it by hand manually on my own website. It was really a pain. Now there's these incredible websites like Kickstarter that can do, build these campaigns that are really, they're like a wonderful validation campaign, right? Pre-orders, customer engagement, like a lot of good elements to it. So then maybe I'll check out Kickstarter and see if that might be a way to get some more learning from the process. And I reached out to my friend Fred Wilson at Union Square Ventures, and I said, hey, do you know anybody at Kickstarter? He's an investor who might talk to me about whether this is a good idea. He said, no problem. Yancey, the CEO of Kickstarter, would be happy to talk to you. Next thing I know, Yancey calls me. I kind of sketch out for him what I'm thinking. He says, well, if you decide to do this, you will have the most successful publishing Kickstarter of all time. He called it right there on the spot, first meeting within 30 minutes. And I thought he was being being nice. But that is in fact what happened. We had this incredible, just this incredible grassroots response to the campaign, which was awesome. And so that's how the Leaders Guide came out. I said, okay, well, I'll build an MVP of some of the ideas that I want to say. I'll package it up as a workbook, not as a kind of mass market airport book, using all this mountain of materials of training exercises and stuff that I've been using all these years, and package it together. And those who back the campaign will get a copy, but nobody else will. So the idea is it was supposed to be a limited one print run, one-time event to learn. And people in publishing think that's crazy because it's like, wait, but now you have people who want to buy the book and you won't take their money. But I've been saying for years, MVP is not about making money, it's about learning. So I'm sorry to those who are frustrated by it, but the goal of this activity was to try to learn as much as possible to make the next book that I write really as good as it can be. So for those who were part of the campaign, I thank you. I hope you are enjoying the book as much as I did writing it. But most importantly, for those who were not part of it, who still want to get exposed to that idea, like, please, we do the occasional Leaders Guide workshop, including coming up at the conference. So please do come to those.
Okay, super. Can you tell me anything that you're particularly looking forward to in terms of Lean Startup Week, or something you think that attendees maybe should be most excited about?
Oh man, Lean Startup Week. First of all, if the clue is in the name, okay, when we started doing the Lean Startup Conference, first time we did it, it was called the Startup Lessons Learned Conference. Okay, we weren't even smart enough to brand it properly. It was like, people who liked my blog. It was like 300 people in a hotel ballroom, and we had like 12 speakers. And listen, it was great. I really had a wonderful time, but like, it was very manageable as a thing. Lean Startup Week is like a total behemoth. There's just so many speakers and workshops and hands-on activity. It's just like, I even find it overwhelming to navigate. I always look forward to the big name speakers, right? So I'm super excited that, Steve Case and Guy Kawasaki and just, some like pretty famous folks are coming. But every year, and I hope other people feel this way too, the highlight of the conference for me every year is some speaker I never heard of before. We have a real point of view at Lean Startup Week that is distinct from every other conference I've ever attended or been part of, that we intentionally want to bring people on stage who you've never heard of, who are doing something unusual, who are not on the speaking circuit, who are not the usual people you can see at every other tech startup conference. So we work really hard. We have a very unusual meritocratic selection process. We have a much more diverse range of speakers, not through quotas or anything, but simply because, you know, we believe in investing in the pipeline changes the pipeline. And so, you know, yes, you know, famous big name companies, super hot startups. We always have that. It's a big important part of the community, of course. But I would really encourage people to look into the program. And when you see names you don't recognize, instead of letting your eyes glaze over and say, let me skip on to the next famous dude. Instead, like, just sample at random. Be like, I wonder, like, well, what can I learn from the city of Hayward? Or, like, you know, what can I learn from these crazy guys making mushrooms in Berkeley? And that's not as illicit as it sounds. You know, what can I learn from people who are trying to get people's water bills paid? I mean, just like you never know where you're going to find real insight. And the cool thing about it is, as entrepreneurs, as a community of entrepreneurs, what you can learn from an individual is much more about the way that they work and the way their minds work than anything particular about their business. So my advice to people who are trying to navigate this massive program is, don't just go to the sessions that seem relevant to you. Intentionally go to the ones that don't seem relevant and see how those people think. I think, you know, that's pretty cool. And then for those who've been around for a while, there's also a bit of a reunion. You know, we all got a lot of the kind of lean startup all-stars from over the years. You know, some of our favorite speakers coming back. So I'm always excited about that part too.
Yeah, you know what? I can speak to that from personal experience, because I remember the first tactical thing I learned 4 years ago in A/B testing, and then was just blown away by the thinking that Mark Little dropped down around how the lean startup at GE. I've shared that with so many people. It just blows people's minds, and it really resonated that way for me. So I could second that with you. I'm curious.
We should give Charles Hudson a shout out. He was my original co-organizer of the first conference, and he's coming back to speak this year. So
that's awesome. I'm looking forward to
seeing him. That's gonna be awesome. And there was one other thing I was gonna say. So I'll give an example. Just a couple of years ago, we had Todd Park from the U.S. government. He was the chief technology officer of the U.S. government at the time, coming to speak. And I remember people were like, "Why is there this government dude on the program? Like, what's going on? I hear these government people coming." And afterwards, I mean, you should go. Anyone hasn't seen the video, like, go look it up. It's easy to find. I mean, he blew people away with a really passionate call to service that just made you realize this is a true entrepreneur, and the fact that he has the U.S. government on his business card doesn't diminish from the fact that he has that entrepreneurial point of view. Anyway, so you just never know what you're going to learn from people who are trying to solve the same problem that you are in a different domain. So definitely encourage people to just drink from the fire hose and get inspired.
What do you think about the differences between the different types of interactions that you get, say, in a big talk versus an Ignite talk versus one of the classes? Any perspectives you might want to share?
You know, it's funny because I'm personally quite introverted, so I find conferences very overwhelming. I much prefer the small sessions myself to the big keynotes and big things. What I would say is that the big keynote speeches are important. And that is a major way that we get a shared set of stories as a community that we can all tell to each other, that we can use in our evangelism, we can get inspired. The Ignite talks are way wackier. You know, we put some pretty off the wall stuff. I mean, the guy was saying the Lean Startup song, was that last year or the year before? I mean, you never know what you're going to get. But that's kind of fun in its own way because the avant-garde tends to be very thought-provoking for those of us who are open-minded about it. Look, when somebody's like, this is their very first exposure to Lean Startup, and they work in a really boring big company, and they're just like putting their toe in the water, like, keynotes probably for them more than the Ignites that for the rest of us who've been around for a little while, which you never know. Some of them are amazing. Some of them you're just like, whoa, please don't say that. But then I really encourage people to get beyond passive listening, whether that's through the mentorship program, through the classes, through the workshops, through even the site visits. I mean, an entrepreneurship conference that's about talking is a contradiction in terms. So the purpose of all the energizing stuff that we do to get you inspired is not that you walk away like, wow, I learned something great by sitting in my seat and doing nothing. The goal is to move you to action, to do something, to try to make your startup more successful as a result of being there, or to take some specific technique or action back to your company and be an evangelist for that. So I really encourage everybody who can to to do Startup Weekend, or to go into the workshops, or like I said, do the site visits and just at least see some startups at work yourself. But whenever possible, you have a chance to implement, do it. One of my proudest moments as a conference speaker, I won't say which conference it is because the organizers would be mad at me, but I was speaking at a different conference, not Lean Startup. That was also a week-long mega affair. And I was just a random speaker. So I gave my talk and I said hi to people. And a few months later, I met someone who was in the audience that day who had sought me out. He tracked me down at another conference because he wanted to tell me his story. And he said, listen, when you gave that talk at that big time conference, I was there with my co-founder and our whole team. We literally walked out of your session, packed our bags, and flew home because we realized our startup was doomed and we urgently had to pivot. And we left the conference. We didn't see anything else after that moment. And you literally saved our startup. We would have run out of money. We were completely doomed, and we were just completely in denial about it. And you helped us work through. And I was like, that's such a great story. Someone who actually took action rather than sat in the conference is much more my goal as an organizer. So, your startup is probably fine and it's not doomed. I'm sure everything is fine, but just in case.
That's super. That's great. That's gotta be so rewarding, right?
Yeah, it was a great feeling.
Yeah.
Conference organizers probably weren't thrilled, but I was pretty excited.
Hopefully they didn't miss him. Hopefully the team wasn't that big. So we're just at about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to the other question that everybody's asking about long-term stock exchange. Everybody wants to know what's going on. They hear about it and they want to engage because the rationale seems to make so much sense, especially given what we've talked about in the entrepreneurship as a discipline inside of an enterprise. So can you just share a little bit about some successes to date and what's in store for the near future?
Sure. Yeah. So for those that don't know, the LTSE, the Long-Term Stock Exchange, is my new startup. And our goal is to change the problem of short-term thinking on the part of public companies and their investors. So we're going to do that by creating a new stock exchange that's in the same regulatory category as New York and NASDAQ. And our pitch to CEOs and companies who are thinking about listing on our exchange is we can give you the full access to the breadth and depth of public market liquidity, access to the complete capital markets of today, without the problems of short-term volatility and the short-term pressures that drive most companies to become not innovative. For me, it's a very personal project because I have seen this up close and personal. The more companies I work with, the more companies that go public, you can have the greatest management system in the world that you've installed through your transformation or whatever. But if the incentives that managers face are warped, it's like a gravitational force that will destroy the skeleton eventually. It's just too powerful a thing to resist. And most managers today have extremely short-term bonuses and stock options that cause them to watch the ticker symbol and try to drive that number up kind of by whatever means necessary. And it's really drives so many of the problems we have in our world. And so on behalf of the whole team that's working on this, our goal is to try to take a root cause swing at solving that problem. The reason you haven't heard much about it is building a new stock exchange is a hard thing to do. It requires a huge amount of legal and regulatory process, to get certified by the SEC and to get people in DC comfortable with us. So because of that sensitivity, we've been pretty quiet on purpose because we're really kind of heads down with the regulatory process. But rest assured, this is happening. We have raised money. We have a full-time team split across San Francisco, New York, and DC. So you'll hear more about it in the years to come. But we're really very excited about the progress today.
Super. Can you comment on some of the specific things that skeptics are saying, or some of the more specific objections that people have that just they seem logical to them, but you're like kind of just you run right over them when you really break.
Oh, we hear. I mean, this is one of the. I've never worked on anything in my life as polarizing as this. And that includes Lean Startup, which you got to remember, 6-7 years ago, people thought was really dumb. So so I've been through it before, and so it doesn't faze me too much. Look, the core skepticism is just that it's really hard. I mean, most people I meet with are like, that sounds great, but you could never Like, think of all the things that you can never do. We will never get the SEC and all the regulators to approve it. That's probably true, probably won't. You'll never convince investors to put their money, behind a new framework for capital markets, when there's so much inertia behind the status quo. You'll never convince companies to do something different. I mean, companies that go public are extremely conservative because the founders themselves are about to make $1 billion. So, who wants to rock the boat? Anyway, so there's just like a lot of reasons to be skeptical. And, I mostly tell people, look, I can't guarantee, even our investors can't guarantee that this is going to work, but I think it's an experiment worth running. So all I ask from everyone who supports us is like, help us run this experiment. That's really what matters.
Super. Well, I'm pulling for you. I think it makes a lot of sense, and for what I can see, it sounds very exciting. We have a few minutes left. I don't have any new questions on this part really to dig into, but I'm curious if you have any parting shots or things that you wanted to just kind of share with people as we check out.
Well, I really appreciate everybody tuning in and joining us on this journey. I certainly look forward to people coming to the Lean Startup Week. Please, if you do come in person, please come say hello. Happy to shake hands, happy to do selfies and sign books and whatever. I really don't mind. It's really, to me, very touching that so many people get excited about this every year. If you've never been to the conference before and are kind of on the fence, run the experiment. Come give it a try. It's relatively inexpensive as conferences go. We have bootstrapper passes. If you really can't afford it, you're in a nonprofit. There's ways to get a ticket at a way reduced rate. So don't let cost be an obstacle. Plus, if you're in a startup, the opportunity cost of your time is really what matters. So if you're not sure, find somebody who's been, ask them about their experience. If you need help with that, get in touch with us. We're really easy to get a hold of. We can help you talk through the issue. And if you want to meet somebody who was at last year's conference, we've had now, the conference has been going on long enough. We're now, 6th, 7th, 8th year, something like that, that we now have had speakers who a couple years ago were attendees, people whose startups have become hot and successful, who were just a guy in the crowd a few years ago. So there's a really different vibe to this than most of the conferences you've been to. So I'm proud of that. And so I hope you'll consider coming and join us. And of course, if you can't come in person, there's hundreds of live stream locations where the conference is simulcast all over the world. So please do check that out too. And if you want to host such an event, get in touch with us too. That entire live stream simulcast thing, that's all free. So we don't make money from that. We just do it to increase the size of the community that can be part of it every year.
So like you say, to the smallest entrepreneur or to the largest corporate, just run the experiment, try it and see, right? And we mentioned a couple of those companies that were at the conference last year. I would say if you're curious about coming, watch Mark Little's discussion from last year. Watch Ryan Hoover, right? Because he was one of those guys who was in the crowd and then started this startup where everybody's. I get his stuff every day. Tons of people talk about Product Hunt, and he was like, yeah, I was sitting in the conference and I wrote some notes, and this is what I did. So he's exactly that case study. So if you've got nothing else, we're almost out of time. I'm gonna say thanks so much, Eric, for your time. Thanks everybody for joining us, and hand it back over to Felicia.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. This wraps up our show. Lean Startup Week is happening in 2 weeks, so don't wait another year to join us. Visit leanstartup.co for more information.